It was a chilly morning on January 15, 1947, when a local mother taking a walk with her young child stumbled upon a gruesome sight in the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. At first glance, the object lying in the vacant lot appeared to be a discarded store mannequin broken into two pieces and left amidst the weeds. As she drew closer, the horrifying reality became clear, and panic set in immediately. This was no mannequin, but the severed body of a young woman drained of blood and posed with chilling precision. The discovery would spark one of the most extensive manhunts in California history and birth a dark legend that haunts Hollywood to this day. The city of Los Angeles in 1947 was a place of stark contrasts, where the glitz of the golden age of Hollywood masked a seedy underbelly of corruption and crime. Post-war optimism was high, but so was the influx of drifters and dreamers looking for fame in the motion picture industry. The streets were filled with vintage automobiles and men in fedoras, while neon signs flickered above nightclubs that promised escape. Yet beneath the palm trees and sunshine, a predator had been lurking, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. This brutal crime would shatter the illusion of safety in the City of Angels and expose the dangerous reality facing young women who arrived with stars in their eyes. Betty Bersinger, the woman who found the body, initially thought she was looking at trash dumped in the empty lot on South Norton Avenue. The grass was overgrown, and the morning dew still clung to the weeds as she pushed her stroller along the sidewalk. When she realized she was looking at a human corpse, she grabbed her daughter and ran to a nearby house to call the police. The shock of the discovery rippled through the neighborhood almost instantly. By the time the first patrol car arrived, a small crowd had already begun to gather, their faces pale, with a mixture of curiosity and horror at the scene unfolding before them. When the Los Angeles Police Department arrived, they found a crime scene that was both grotesque and strangely sterile. The body had been severed at the waist with surgical precision, and there was almost no blood at the scene, indicating the murder had taken place elsewhere. The victim had been washed clean before being dumped, and her arms were positioned above her head. The detectives on the scene, including Harry Hansen and Finnis Brown, knew immediately they were dealing with a killer who was calculated and methodical. This was not a crime of passion, but a cold and deliberate act designed to shock and terrify anyone who saw it. Within hours, the press descended upon South Norton Avenue like a swarm of locusts, trampling over potential evidence in their rush to get the scoop. Reporters from the Los Angeles Examiner and the Los Angeles Herald Express fought for position, flashing their cameras and shouting questions at the overwhelmed officers. The media frenzy that ensued was unprecedented, turning the investigation into a circus before it had barely begun. This aggressive reporting style would characterize the entire case, with journalists often arriving at leads before the police and sometimes withholding information to sell more papers. The line between news and exploitation blurred as the city became obsessed with the case. The identity of the victim was initially a mystery, as she had no identification on her person. The police utilized a proto-fax machine, known as Sound Photo, to send her fingerprints to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Washington, District of Columbia. The return was swift, and the victim was identified as 22-year-old Elizabeth Short. She had been arrested once before for underage drinking in Santa Barbara, which is why her prints were on file. With a name now attached to the body, the press began to dig into her past, creating a narrative that would oscillate between a tragic victim and a seductress who courted danger. Elizabeth Short was more than just a headline. She was a daughter and a sister with dreams of making it big in Hollywood. Born in Boston, Massachusetts, she was one of 5 daughters raised by a single mother after her father disappeared during the Great Depression. She grew up in a modest household and loved going to the cinema, where she could escape into the glamorous worlds of her favorite actresses. Friends remembered her as vibrant and beautiful, with a desire to be seen and admired. She was a typical young woman of her era, caught up in the romance and allure of the silver screen, hoping to find her place in the spotlight. As a teenager, Elizabeth suffered from asthma and was sent to spend winters in Florida, where the climate was milder. It was there she met a decorated Army Air Force officer named Matthew Gordon Jr. They fell deeply in love and planned to marry, but tragedy struck when Gordon was killed in a plane crash in India, just days before the end of the Second World War. His death devastated Elizabeth, and many believe she never truly recovered from the loss. She began to dress almost exclusively in black, perhaps as a sign of mourning or simply because it suited her dramatic sense of style. After the war, Elizabeth drifted between Florida, Massachusetts, and eventually California. She worked briefly as a waitress, but her true ambition remained the movies. In 1946, she arrived in Los Angeles, rejoining a former boyfriend she had met in Florida. However, the relationship quickly soured, and she found herself alone in the sprawling city. She moved, frequently staying in hotels, boarding houses, and private homes, rarely settling in one place for more than a few weeks. This transient lifestyle made it difficult for police to track her movements or identify a consistent circle of friends who might have known her killer. In the months leading up to her death, Elizabeth Short was a familiar face in the Hollywood nightlife scene. She frequented hotspots like the Bordner's Bar and the Florentine Gardens, where she would nurse a single drink in hope to be discovered by a talent scout. Despite the later sensationalized reports, there was no evidence she ever worked as a prostitute. She was known to be a tease, often accepting dinners and drinks from men, but refusing their advances at the end of the night. This behavior, while common for young women navigating the social scene, may have inadvertently angered the wrong man. The nickname, the Black Dahlia, originated from a local drugstore in Long Beach, where Elizabeth was a customer. It was a play on the popular movie, The Blue Dahlia, starring Alan Ladd and Veronica Lake, which was in theaters at the time. The press latched onto the moniker immediately, as it perfectly encapsulated the noir atmosphere of the crime. The name added a layer of mystique to the case, transforming Elizabeth Short from a murder victim into a dark celebrity. It became the headline on every newspaper and the talk of every diner across America, cementing her status as a tragic icon. The last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth Short was on January 9, 1947, 6 days before her body was found. She had been on a trip to San Diego with a married salesman named Robert Red Manley. Manley dropped her off at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, where she was supposed to meet her sister. Witnesses saw her in the lobby making telephone calls, and she was later seen walking south down Olive Street. After that moment, she vanished into the sprawling metropolis, leaving behind a gap of nearly 1 week that investigators have never been able to fully account for. Robert Red Manley became the first prime suspect in the investigation. He was the last person known to see her alive, and his car was searched thoroughly by police. Manley admitted to having an affair with Elizabeth, but insisted he left her at the Biltmore and returned to his family in San Diego. He passed a polygraph test and was eventually cleared of suspicion, but the stress of the investigation took a toll on his mental health. For years, he lived under the shadow of the accusation, a common fate for many men who crossed paths with the Black Dahlia. The missing week between January 9th and January 15th remains the biggest puzzle of the entire case. Where was Elizabeth Short during those 6 days? Did she stay with a friend, a lover, or was she held captive by her killer? Some theories suggest she may have been kept at a motel, or a private residence possibly sedated or restrained. The lack of decomposition on her body suggested she was killed only hours before being dumped, but her stomach contained feces, indicating she had likely been fed during her captivity. This gap in the timeline is where the truth of the murder likely hides. The autopsy performed by Dr. Frederick Newbar revealed the sheer brutality of the crime. The cause of death was determined to be hemorrhage and shock from a concussion and lacerations to the face. The severance of the body was performed between the second and third lumbar vertebrae. The procedure was done with such skill that investigators believe the killer had medical training. There was no bone fragmentation, suggesting the killer knew exactly where to cut to separate the spine. This detail led detectives to focus their search on doctors, medical students, and butchers. One of the most chilling aspects of the crime was the injury inflicted on her face. The killer had carved lacerations from the corners of her mouth toward her ears, creating a grotesque effect known as a Glasgow smile. This mutilation was a sign of intense personal rage and a desire to degrade the victim. It ensured that even in death, Elizabeth could not be viewed without horror. The specific nature of this wound, combined with the posing of the body, suggested the killer wanted to make a statement or perhaps create a twisted piece of art. As the investigation dragged on, the Los Angeles Police Department interviewed hundreds of suspects and processed thousands of tips. The case became a logistical nightmare as the department was flooded with false confessions. Over the years, more than 50 people have confessed to the murder, ranging from attention seekers to mentally unstable individuals. Each confession had to be investigated, wasting valuable time and resources. The pressure from the public and the press to solve the case was immense, leading to desperate measures and a chaotic investigation room. On January 24th, a suspicious envelope arrived at the Los Angeles Examiner, addressed to the police. The sender had used letters cut from newspaper headlines to form the address. Inside were Elizabeth Short's birth certificate, her social security card, and an address book with the name Mark Hansen on the cover. The sender included a note claiming to be the killer and promising to send more evidence. The packet had been soaked in gasoline, wiping away any fingerprints. This taunting communication was eerily similar to the letters sent by Jack the Ripper decades earlier. The address book belonged to Mark Hansen, a wealthy nightclub owner who allowed Elizabeth and other young women to stay at his home. Hansen became a significant person of interest. He was a powerful figure in the Hollywood underworld, with connections to police and politicians. Elizabeth had rebuffed his sexual advances, which gave him a potential motive. However, despite intense interrogation and surveillance, no hard evidence ever linked Hansen directly to the murder. He remained one of the many enigmatic figures surrounding the case who seemed to know more than he was saying. Another compelling suspect was Dr. George Hodel, a brilliant but troubled physician with a high IQ and a history of scandal. Hodel ran a clinic in Los Angeles and was known for his lavish parties attended by artists and intellectuals. His own daughter had accused him of abuse, and he was a suspect in the death of his secretary. Police bugged his home in 1950 and recorded disturbing conversations where he seemed to allude to his involvement in the Black Dahlia murder. He was heard saying, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they could not prove it now." The transcripts of the Hodel wiretaps revealed a man who believed he was above the law. He spoke of paying off police officers and bragged about his intelligence. Despite the incriminating recordings, George Hodel was never charged. He abruptly left the country, moving to Asia, where he lived for decades. Some believe his connections protected him, while others think the evidence was simply too circumstantial to secure a conviction. His departure left a void in the case, that would later be filled by his own son. Decades later, Steve Hodel, a retired Los Angeles Police Department homicide detective, began investigating his own father. After George Hodel died, Steve found a photo album containing a picture of a woman who resembled Elizabeth Short. He spent years building a case against his father, arguing that the surgical precision of the cut and the psychological profile matched George Hodel perfectly. Steve Hodel published multiple best-selling books outlining his theory, convincing many that the doctor was indeed the mastermind behind the gruesome crime. Other suspects included Leslie Dillon, a bellhop and aspiring writer, who knew a suspicious amount of detail about the murder. He contacted police with theories that seemed too accurate to be mere speculation. Dillon was detained and interrogated aggressively by the police psychiatrist Dr. Paul DeRiver, who was eager to solve the case. However, it was later revealed that Dillon was likely in San Francisco at the time of the murder. The pursuit of Dillon is now seen by many as a miscarriage of justice driven by a desperate need to close the case. The investigation was also hampered by the corruption within the Los Angeles Police Department during the late 1940s. The Gangster Squad, a secret unit created to fight organized crime, often operated outside the law. Evidence went missing and files were misplaced. The rivalry between the police and the sheriff department further complicated matters. In this environment of secrecy and vice, it was easy for a killer with the right connections to slip through the cracks. The Black Dahlia case became a symbol of the institutional failures of the era. Some criminologists have drawn links between the Black Dahlia murder and the Cleveland Torso murders, which took place in Ohio in the 1930s. Both cases involved the dismemberment of bodies and the draining of blood. The killer in Cleveland was never caught, and some theorized he may have moved to California. While the modus operandi had similarities, there was no definitive physical evidence linking the two crime sprees. The idea of a transcontinental serial killer remains a terrifying but unproven possibility. As the years turned into decades, the leads grew cold. The detectives who originally worked the case retired or passed away, and the physical evidence began to deteriorate. The Black Dahlia case was officially listed as unsolved, but it never truly faded from the public consciousness. Every few years, a new book or documentary claims to have solved the mystery, presenting new suspects or reinterpreting old evidence. Yet the Los Angeles District Attorney has never had enough to prosecute anyone living or dead. The cultural impact of the Black Dahlia is immeasurable. It has inspired countless novels, movies, and video games, becoming a dark folklore of the 20th century. James Ellroy wrote a famous novel based on the case, which was later adapted into a major motion picture. The story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of Hollywood and the exploitation of women. It strips away the glamour of the era to reveal the brutal violence that can hide behind a smiling facade. The Biltmore Hotel, where Elizabeth was last seen, is said to be haunted by her spirit. Guests and staff have reported seeing a woman in black walking through the lobby or vanishing around corners. These ghost stories keep the legend alive, blending fact with supernatural fiction. Whether or not one believes in ghosts, the presence of Elizabeth Short is still felt in Los Angeles. She has become a permanent resident of the city history, a tragic figure frozen in time at the age of 22. Modern forensic science has unfortunately been unable to crack the case due to the loss of original evidence. DNA testing was not available in 1947, and much of the biological material was mishandled or destroyed over the years. The envelopes sent to the examiner and the letters were handled by too many people to yield usable prints today. Unless a confession letter or a hidden trophy is found in an attic somewhere, it is unlikely that the Black Dahlia murder will ever be solved with absolute certainty. In the end, we must remember that behind the sensational headlines and the grisly details was a real human being. Elizabeth Short was a young woman with hopes and fears who met a terrible end. She was not just a prop in a noir mystery, but a victim of extreme violence. By focusing solely on the mystery, we risk dehumanizing her all over again. Her story is a reminder of the vulnerability of those who live on the margins of society, seeking connection and validation. The Black Dahlia remains Hollywood's most enduring mystery, not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because it represents the death of innocence. It marked a turning point where the post-war dream collided with a nightmare. As long as the killer remains nameless, the shadow of Elizabeth Short will continue to cast a long silhouette over the city of angels, reminding us that some puzzles are destined to remain incomplete forever.